Hello and welcome to UnJustified, where we always cover the truth, the facts, the good, the bad, the ugly, on an unbiased and sometimes very unpopular opinion. If you're not a member of our newest channel, Unjustified Crimes, please join us over there as well. You can hit the link in the description box below. There is where we cover all of the breaking crime news. And let's get right into today's video.
From the city of Moab, Utah, a statement on investigative review of August the 12th Petito and Laundrie incident. After a formal complaint was filed with the Moab City Police Department, an independent law enforcement agency has completed a thorough review of the August the 12th, 2021 domestic violence incident involving Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. The independent agency's investigative report finds that the officers who responded to the incident made several unintentional mistakes that stemmed from the fact that officers failed to cite Ms. Petito for domestic violence. The city acknowledges that this finding may raise questions, and the issue is examined extensively in the investigative report. So what they're saying is what they did wrong is not arrest Gabby as they should have. And that is their conclusion to what they did wrong. The independent agency's investigative report finds that the officers who responded to the incident made several unintentional mistakes that stem from the fact that officers failed to cite Ms. Petito for domestic violence. The city acknowledges that this finding may raise questions, and the issue is examined extensively in the investigative report. The report recommends improvements to both the policies and the training of the Moab City Police Department. These recommendations include providing additional training in domestic violence investigation, as well as additional legal training to ensure officers understand state laws and statutes, conducting an overall policy review, conducting a software review, and strengthening the review process for incident reports. The investigative report also finds that a statement was never obtained from the original 911 caller, very interesting, and recommends that be done to make the incident report more complete. The city intends to implement the report's recommendations. Based on the reports, the city of Moab believes our officers showed kindness, respect, and empathy in their handling of this incident. As the Moab City Police Department continues its daily mission to serve our community, efforts are underway to provide additional resources and tools to assist in addressing domestic violence incidents. Plans are in place to add a trained domestic violence specialist to oversee incidents investigated by Moab officers. We also will implement added and ongoing and testing to ensure that the officers understand policies and procedures. The city of Moab sends our sincere condolences to the Petito family, and our hearts go out to them as they continue to deal with the tragic loss of their daughter. This document contains the investigative review into the Moab case number 2021-001108 was investigated. And then the table of contents, and then the introduction. On September the 27th, 2021, I was asked to conduct an independent investigation into the way Moab Police Department handled a domestic violence incident that occurred on August the 12th, 2021. The incident has been documented by Moab police officers Eric Pratt and Daniel Robbins and is identified by Moab Police Department by case number. There were also two additional officers on scene, Park Ranger Melissa Halls and Park Ranger Ryan Krall. The incident involved Brian Christopher Laundrie and Gabrielle Gabby Petito. I was asked to conduct this investigation by Chief Brett Edge and Assistant Chief Braden Palmer. Officer Pratt has worked with the Moab City Police Department intermittently since July of 2018. This included part-time employment and full-time employment. Officer Pratt returned full-time with Moab City Police Department in December of 2020. Officer Pratt has approximately 16 years of law enforcement experience. At the time of this incident, Officer Pratt was acting field training officer for Officer Robbins. Officer Robbins was hired in May of 2021 with the Moab City Police Department and had no prior law enforcement experience. At the time of this incident, Officer Robbins was on the final phase of his field training program. So he had only actually been in law enforcement for roughly 2.5 to 3 months when this occurrence happened. I have been forwarded an email from the initial complaint. Attorney Tanya Reeves, which I have attached to this report. Chief Edge indicated the Moab Police Department received the complaint and they believe there is value and insight to be gained from having an independent investigation that will ultimately provide insight and improve the department's responses to domestic violence cases moving forward. The investigator in this case is Captain Brandon Ratcliffe, who is employed by the Price City Police Department. Disclaimer: as part of my investigation, I reviewed the body-worn camera footage and interviewed Assistant Chief Palmer, Officer Pratt, and Officer Robbins. The interviews were recorded using an audio recording device. The interviews with Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins were done following the issuance of a Garrity Statement of Right. While watching the videos and while listening to the audio interviews, I typed notes as it related to each of the recordings. During those notes, there were times where I had to transcribe the interactions, questions, and answers. The notes should in no way be considered an exact transcription of the recordings, as they are likely not accurate and they lack the appropriate grammar and spelling into the way the words were actually said compared to how they were written. The notes were made specifically to allow myself a way to review what I observed more easily rather than trying to review these recordings more times than absolutely necessary. Taking notes into each of these recordings have provided me the ability to document a more accurate and detailed report regarding this investigation. On a part-time basis, I have spent months reviewing this case and have been provided the luxury of being able to pause, rewind, fast forward, take notes, etc. This same luxury is not afforded in the grand majority of police investigations. The officers in this case had about 75 minutes, while I've had an unlimited amount of time. While I have the reports and recordings from this case, I will not pretend to know that I have the same perception the officers had while investigating this case. There are many what-ifs that have presented itself as part of this investigation. The primary one would be, would Gabby be alive today if this case was handled differently? That is an impossible question to answer, despite it being the answer many people want to know. Nobody knows, and nobody will ever know the answer to that question. My job is to provide information into the details of this investigation and if it was handled appropriately. Synopsis. This investigation arises after Moab Police Department received a complaint about the way Moab Police Department case number was handled. The complaint was received by Moab Police Department on September the 21st, 2021 by Tanya Reeves. A follow-up complaint was received by Tanya Reeves on October the 1st, 2021. I was asked to complete this investigation on September the 27th, 2021. A summary of the facts in this case will be detailed below. The summary will come from information obtained from the officer reports, dispatch notes and audio, witness statements, and body-worn camera video of the incident. The initial call to dispatch. On August the 12th, 2021, at 16:39 and 16, and that would be 4:39 p.m., the Grand County Dispatch Center received a call from who was calling to report what he described as a domestic dispute. Redacted reports he was driving and saw a gentleman slapping a girl. Stated that he stopped driving and the male and female ran up and down the sidewalk where he proceeded to hit her. Stated that they hopped in the van and drove off, and said he took a picture of the license plate and describes the vehicle and the license plate information. He also further describes the make, model, and other characteristics of the van. Dispatch uses the emergency tone and alerts all law enforcement working in the area of the call they just received. Dispatch states they had a report of a male hitting a female and the van left northbound from the Moonflower Community Co-op. Dispatch further provided a description of the vehicle to law enforcement. Officer Pratt arrives on scene at the Moonflower Community Co-op where the incident took place and asks dispatch for the reporting party's phone number. Officer Pratt also tells dispatch that he spoke to another witness who gave more details on the vehicle that left. Based on Officer Pratt's report, the witness Officer Pratt is referring to is redacted. Officer Rob vehicle on the turnoff road that goes into Arches National Park after he observed the van cross over the double yellow line and crosses back over and hits the curb on the passenger side. Officer Robbins reports to dispatch the driver may be intoxicated after observing the driving pattern. Officer Robbins stops the vehicle and has the female exit the vehicle, separating the male driver and the female passenger. From this point forward, the male and female, Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito, never speak to each other again while law enforcement is in contact. Brian Laundrie's statement to the law enforcement. Brian stated that he and Gabby had not been drinking and said that it had been a quote-unquote long day. Brian stated their little squabble started earlier this day when they were at the coffee shop. Brian stated they had been there for so long, from about 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. Brian stated the flies had been intense and that the flies have definitely been getting to her. Brian stated when they got back to the van, there was some little dirt at the back of the van. Brian stated he moved their food around and there was a little disagreement there. When asked about the disagreement, Brian stated it wasn't much of a disagreement, but went on to say he had dirty feet and said there were little things, relationship things, that they were arguing about. Brian stated Gabby was working on her website and blog and said he gave her time. Brian stated they had a nice morning, but Gabby got worked up as they were trying to get their day going. Brian said he tried to distance himself from Gabby by locking the van up and walking away. Brian said while doing this, he suggested to Gabby that they both just take a breather. Brian said he felt that was the only way for them to calm down, but Gabby was getting worked up. Brian said Gabby had her phone and was trying to get the keys from him, and that is when he was pushing her away. Brian said he knew he shouldn't push her, but stated he was just trying to push her away, stating they needed to take a minute, step back, and breathe. Brian said he had the keys because he didn't want Gabby to go anywhere as he did not have his phone, and then added he doesn't really have a phone and was worried about her leaving without him and him being left alone. Later on, Brian would provide Officer Robbins his phone and confirm the number by looking at his cell phone. This was interesting considering that he had previously said that he really didn't have a phone. Brian said things weren't physical before the point Brian said, "Let's just take a breather," stating he was locking up the van and they should go for a walk. Brian said it was at the time that Gabby was trying to get the keys from him where he demonstrated pushing her away and said, "That is when she hit me." Brian said he didn't get really physical, but stated he was just trying to push Gabby away and not get hit. Brian said this was when he got really loud and stated that was what probably drew everyone's attention. Brian said he was yelling, "Back up, get away." Brian said he was trying to make her calm down and pointed out to Gabby that everyone was watching. Brian said the injury now was from Gabby's phone. Brian said Gabby had jumped on him and was swinging when he pushed her. Brian stated Gabby also wore rings, and the combination of the phone, her rings, and her nails are what likely caused his injuries. Park Ranger Ryan Krall points out scratches on the left side of Brian's neck, left side of his nose, scratch near the center of his face, and bruising bleeding on the right side of his head. Officer Robbins finds an additional injury on Brian's right bicep and tricep area. Brian said he was not in any pain and that he wasn't complaining. When asked about medication, Brian said he doesn't take any, but said Gabby has told him in the past to take Xanax because he has high anxiety. When asked if Gabby takes medication, he replies while chuckling and smirking, "Well, she's just crazy." Brian then immediately takes back the comment by saying he is kidding. In regards to the driving behavior, Brian stated he hit the curb because Gabby grabbed and turned the wheel. Brian said Gabby told him, quote, "I can't believe we're getting pulled over," unquote, when she grabbed the wheel. When asked about his speed, Brian stated it was probably from the adrenaline of getting pulled over and Gabby grabbing the wheel, further stating that he was still shaken up from everything that just happened. Brian apologized multiple times for his driving, stating if he was driving too fast before getting pulled over, he was sorry. Brian said they were headed to the park to get water. Gabby's statement to law enforcement. While still in the vehicle, Gabby is asked why she was crying. Gabby stated they have been fighting this morning, stating there have been personal issues. Gabby states, "I was distracting him from driving, I'm sorry." Once separated, Gabby said that she has been having a very stressed morning, later confirming they have not been drinking and they do not drink. Gabby said she was trying to get work done and was apologizing to Brian after she had thrown a bunch of stuff in the back of the van. Gabby said she gets so stressed out and has OCD. Gabby further stated she has a mean attitude, but was not trying to be mean about straightening things up. Gabby said she was apologizing, but said it was in a mean tone. And Brian got frustrated with her and locked her out of the van and told her to go take a breather. Gabby said she wanted to get going and said they were out of water and they were going to the park to refill with water. Gabby states that she is trying to start a blog and is building her website and has been stressed about it. Gabby stated she had so much work she was doing on her computer and said Brian doesn't really believe that she can do any of it, which was upsetting to her. Gabby states they have been fighting all morning and Brian wouldn't let her in the van before. When asked why Brian wouldn't let her in the van, Gabby said Brian told her that she needed to calm down. Gabby said she is perfectly calm and states Brian really stresses her out and said it has been a rough morning. Gabby said Brian walked away to take a breather, but she didn't want to. Gabby said she wanted to sit in the van because all of her stuff was in there. Gabby stated she had been working in the van and that is where she wanted to be. Gabby said Brian told her to relax, but she didn't want to, so she got really mad. Gabby was asked about the injuries to her left cheek and left arm, and Gabby initially said that she wasn't sure what caused it, stating that the incident happened really fast. Gabby said she was trying to get back in the van and said that Brian's backpack was what got her. Gabby was told about witnesses that reported Brian had hit her. Gabby responded, "To be honest, I definitely hit him first." Gabby said she had slapped Brian a couple of times and Brian kept telling her to shut up. Gabby said she hit Brian as I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. Gabby said Brian reacted by grabbing her arm so I wouldn't slap him. Officer Pratt asked if Brian only grabbed her, and she said yes. Officer Pratt then asked, "Did he hit you though?" And Gabby replied saying, "I guess, but I hit him first." Gabby stated Brian grabbed her face, I guess, while also demonstrating this action. Gabby states, "Like he didn't punch me in the face." Gabby said Brian grabbed her face and said she could feel a cut on her left cheek. And Gabby stated when she touches it, it burns. When asked about the van hitting into the curb, Gabby said, "I hit him," and stated that was the reason Brian hit the curb. Gabby stated she was hitting Brian while he was driving, but not a lot, but yeah. Gabby said it didn't last long and said she saw the police car behind them and she demonstrated throwing a punch. Gabby said it was when she saw the police lights that she hit Brian and said, "You're so stupid," or "You're an idiot." Gabby said she did not touch the steering wheel, but for only like a second. "I just saw the lights come on." Gabby demonstrated the punch she did to Brian while stating, "You're an idiot." Gabby was asked again if she ever touched the steering wheel, and Gabby said no. "No, I didn't touch the steering wheel at all." Gabby was asked if she takes any medication, and she stated that she didn't. Gabby said she does yoga as a coping mechanism and states she has high anxiety and OCD. When asked if Brian is patient with her, Gabby said, "Yeah, but it just makes me upset. I know he definitely gets frustrated with me a lot because I have a lot of anxiety, and he definitely has anxiety too." Okay, going into the written and verbal witness statements. Officer Pratt called one of the witnesses redacted by cell phone. Witness also provided a sworn written statement later on. Witness stated he had observed Brian and Gabby involved in a dispute. Witness stated from what he could tell, it appeared at one point they may have been fighting over a phone, and witness thought it may have been Gabby's phone. Witness reported Brian was trying to keep Gabby from getting into the van. Witness said Brian was sitting in the driver's seat while Gabby was trying to get into the van through the driver's door. Witness said Gabby hit Brian a few times in the arm or the face while trying to get into the vehicle. Witness said Gabby forced her way over Brian's lap by the driver's side door and got into the passenger seat. Witness heard Gabby tell Brian, "Why do you have to be so mean?" Witness stated he wasn't sure if it was play fighting, stating Gabby's punches were nothing like slugs to the face, but wasn't sure if it was play fighting. But Witness felt something was off, and he had a weird vibe. Witness stated he wasn't sure how serious the incident was, but to him it seemed like Brian was trying to leave Gabby and possibly take her cell phone. Officer Pratt asked if Witness ever saw Brian strike Gabby. Witness hesitated in his answer and stated he maybe saw a push or a shove, but nothing like a full-on punch to the face or anything. Officer Pratt asked if Witness could tell if the push or shove was an aggressive action or a defensive maneuver. Witness wasn't sure, stating it was a good question and wasn't entirely sure what was exactly going on. Witness said it appeared to him that Brian was trying to close off the passenger side of the vehicle and close things up. Witness said Brian put a backpack or something on the back of the vehicle. Witness said Brian was stepping into the vehicle and Gabby was trying to get in. Witness said he didn't see anything that Brian was kicking Gabby or hitting Gabby, further stating the fighting was kind of light, and they were laughing. Witness again said that Brian was in the driver's seat and had the driver door open, and Gabby was hitting Brian near the arm or maybe in the face with an open hand and was telling Brian to let her in. Officer Pratt made arrangements to pick up a statement from Witness at a later time, and Witness said he would start writing down what he remembered while it was still fresh on his memory. Witness said he was casually observing the incident and said again that something seemed off. Witness's statement was attached to the report. Officer action. Officer Robbins is an investigating officer in this case and was assisted by Officer Pratt. It is my understanding and assumption through watching the body-worn camera videos that Officer Pratt is more experienced than Officer Robbins and was taking an active role in guiding Officer Robbins throughout this investigation. At the end of the investigation, when another call came out, Officer Pratt asked Officer Robbins if he would feel more comfortable taking the call that just came out and leaving Officer Pratt to conclude this investigation. Ultimately, it was decided Officer Robbins would conclude this case, and Officer Pratt left the scene. Officer Robbins advised Gabby that she was not going to be getting charged with anything, but stated he had to separate her and Brian for the night. Officer Robbins tells Brian the same thing, stating that since Gabby did not intend to hurt him, technically speaking, it does not fit the letter of the code. So, he was not charging Gabby with domestic violence assault. Officer Robbins advises them both to not have any contact with each other until the following day and allows Gabby to take custody of the van while Officer Robbins transports Brian to the Bowen Motel. During the investigation, Officer Pratt spoke to Witness, Brian and Gabby to gather their facts of this case. Officer Robbins spoke with Brian and Gabby and took photographs of Brian's injuries and both of their driver's license. Summary and evidence. This section will include the initial complaint, the applicable Utah Code sections, and the applicable Moab City Police Department policies. If there are any other policy sections outside of the domestic violence policy, those sections will also be addressed. In total, this will highlight all of the sections that I will attempt to investigate and, if possible, provide a conclusion on whether or not there was a violation, whether it be of law or policy. Since there was a formal complaint, those complaints will be noted first. For the findings, as it relates to various policies and or laws, I will provide the following responses. Unfounded, meaning investigation finds that there was no violation. Exonerated, investigation finds a violation did occur, but that it was justified, lawful, and or proper. Not sustained, investigation finds there is insufficient evidence to sustain or exonerate a violation of the specific code or policy. Sustained, investigation finds sufficient evidence to establish that the code or policy was violated. Okay, this is the complaints from the attorney, Tanya Reeves. 1. An officer discussed his wife's private medical diagnosis and prescribed medication with Brian Laundrie while he was transporting him to the police station, which was captured on body cam and subsequently released without redaction. Okay, Brian was not transported to the police station. He was transported to a local motel. Moab City Police Policy, Chapter 342 and Section 342.5 addresses the information that is prohibited for release. Line item H states personal information of an officer or the officer's immediate family member. Moab Police Department Policy, Chapter 422 and sections blah 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 states, all recording made by members on any department issued device at any time, and any recording made while acting in an official capacity of this department, regardless of ownership of the device it was made on, shall remain property of the department. Members shall have no expectation of privacy or ownership interest in the content of these recordings. Okay, more chapters and sections, and it says the last paragraph states, quote, all recordings should be reviewed by the custodian of the recordings prior to the public release. Recordings that unreasonably violate a person's privacy or sense of dignity should not be publicly released unless disclosure is required by law or order of the court. This specific complaint is regarding personal information that was discussed by Officer Robbins regarding his wife. The complaint states Officer Robbins disclosed his wife's medical diagnosis and prescribed medication with Brian Laundrie. At no point during their discussion did Officer Robbins specifically disclose any of these things. Officer Robbins states that his wife has anxiety and takes medication for it. Although the line can be drawn and an assumption could be made that there is a diagnosis because of taking medication, we don't know what the actual diagnosis is or what medication she is taking, or even if the medication is prescribed. I was also unable to find anywhere in Moab City Department policy where it specifies what constitutes personal information, and where the line is drawn on what can and cannot be released as it relates to that. Officer Robbins and Officer Pratt spent approximately 75 minutes with Brian and Gabby and demonstrated throughout their contact their ability to have an authentic and respectful conversation regarding the incident. During this interaction, Officer Robbins and Officer Pratt felt comfortable enough to share details regarding their personal lives that related to Brian and Gabby's relationship and this incident. Officer Robbins is aware his body-worn camera is on and recording, and also knows or should know that he has no expectation of privacy as it relates to his law enforcement interactions with the public. Additionally, while knowing his body-worn camera is on, if Officer Robbins was comfortable sharing the generic details he did with Brian, it would be difficult to say that he unreasonably violated his wife's privacy or sense of dignity unless a complaint was made by Officer Robbins' wife herself. And number 2, several officers discussed the legislator's intent to remove discretion from the responding officers in suspected domestic violence calls and strategize around how they can evade the imposition of legislative intent to arrest and or cite suspects. This concern is addressed in detail later on in the report. To provide a brief response, I would disagree that the officers strategized a way around the statute. I would say the officers made a mistake by not reading the entire assault statute as well as misinterpreting the language in the statute. Number 3, an officer appears to carefully and deliberately coach Gabby to answer questions regarding intent in a manner that would allow the officer to avoid issuing her a citation or arrest. Some of the statements made by Officer Pratt to Gabby during the questioning are below. Officer Pratt tells Gabby he has a question for her, and how she answered the question determined what happened next, and further states that she was the only one that could answer the question. Think very hard before you answer the question. When you slapped him those times, were you attempting to cause him physical pain or physical impairment? Gabby answers immediately, shaking her head side to side and stating, no. Well, what were you attempting to do? What was the reason behind the slapping and stuff? What were you attempting to accomplish by slapping him? And Gabby replies, I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. Officer Pratt then says out loud, "Well, it doesn't sound like to me she attempted to injure him." I asked Officer Pratt if he recalled the manner in which he questioned Gabby regarding her intent. Officer Pratt stated he recalled telling Gabby to not answer quickly and to think about her question before answering him. Officer Pratt said, "I do recall telling her to think about it because it's important, and I think that's a fair thing to tell someone." Officer Pratt said you would have to assume that Gabby knew what answer Officer Pratt wanted her to give him, which he never provided her. Officer Pratt said, "What I didn't want to see that day was her take all the criminal responsibility for this incident upon herself at 22 years old." I asked Officer Pratt if he deliberately coached Gabby in her responses to his questions regarding her intent. Officer Pratt said he had no idea what she was going to say. Officer Pratt acknowledged that he could see why some people might think that he coached her. Officer Pratt said, "I truly did not know what she was going to say next. I was afraid that she was going to say something that was going to make her go to jail, and I did not want her to go to jail, but I would have taken her to jail if she had said the other thing, and I don't consider giving someone fair warning to think about their answers because it's an important question to be coaching." Officer Pratt stated multiple times that he wanted an honest answer out of Gabby. Officer Pratt said the way he asked the questions was to stress the importance to Gabby to think about the question and provide an honest answer. Officer Pratt said, "Maybe I coached her into giving me an honest answer because that's what I was wanting. That's what I wanted, and honestly, that's haunted me. Her saying, I just wanted him to stop telling me to calm down. She's little. I have daughters. I can imagine them in these situations. I can totally see one of my daughters just wanting someone to stop telling them to calm down. I believe what she said. I believed it then, and I still do." Officer Pratt said he was not deliberately coaching Gabby and just wanted an honest answer. Officer Robbins was present during the above questioning. I asked Officer Robbins if he recalled this conversation, and he said vaguely. I asked if Officer Robbins recalled the manner in which the questions were asked. Officer Robbins said he didn't and only remembered Gabby being asked about the intent and her denying the intent to hurt Brian. Number 4, an officer refers to Gabby as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who is 110 pounds dripping wet, and refers to Brian Laundrie as a big, tough, strong guy who can defend himself, which is not relevant evidence when evaluating the protocol for legislator mandated action in domestic violence calls. Further, it is unclear why the eye and hair color of one of the subjects would be material to any analysis, and may suggest the officers were operating under a information bias, or that they were unconsciously influenced by stereotypes about who is involved in domestic violence. The complaint Tanya Reeves sent a follow-up email apologizing and stating that she misattributed the blonde-hair, blue-eyed remark, which is correct. As she states in the follow-up email, that information was said by Brian, not the officers. The first part of this complaint is addressed in further detail in this report. Number 5, an officer makes disparaging references to the legislation relevant to this call in the presence of the subjects, claiming that he cannot treat the subjects differently because of the gender of the primary aggressor and then proceeds to do precisely that. While reviewing the body cam footage, this topic is discussed on multiple occasions. Officer Pratt discusses with Brian, Gabby, and other officers the lack of discretion in these cases. When describing this to Brian and Gabby, he explains that it doesn't matter the gender and/or the size of whoever the primary aggressor is, or if the injuries are minimal. Officer Pratt states that they have to treat all domestic violence assault cases the same. Officer Pratt tells Gabby that the law doesn't allow them to treat people different, stating, even if it makes no sense, that you probably could not physically destroy this man the way he could if he attacked you, we can't treat you different. He further tells Gabby that the law was made in Utah because they don't trust the police to make good decisions because too many cops has made bad decisions. He goes on to say that is why they took discretion away on domestic violence cases, stating that whoever the primary aggressor is has to be charged. Officer Pratt tells Gabby, we literally have no choice. He does not want to press charges. We don't have any choice in this. He further states that if he had discretion, he would separate them for the night and tell them to stop hitting each other, but I lawfully don't have discretion here. While an argument could be made that his statements were disparaging, it was done in the context of trying to explain what law enforcement could and could not do. As far as the officers doing precisely what they said they couldn't do, that is explained in further detail in this report. Number 6. The officer references a 911 call that identified Brian Laundrie pushing Gabby Petito away from him, and then says there is a second witness who they haven't spoken with yet but may corroborate this claim. The 911 call of the second witness, in fact, claims Brian Laundrie slapped Gabby Petito. Should the officer have obtained this statement from the second witness or listen to the 911 call before determining who the primary aggressor was? There was only one 911 call in reference to this incident. That caller reported Brian slapping Gabby. The other witness was found on scene at the Moonflower and provided a verbal and written statement later on. This issue is addressed in more detail later on in the report, but in short, the answer would be yes. The officers should have obtained a statement from the 911 caller witness before making a final determination if it was possible for them to do so. Number 7. The officers twisted themselves into knots trying to find a way to avoid effecting an arrest or citation because of their sympathy for this couple and their assessment that no one was actually in danger, which is precisely what the legislator attempted to curtail, substituting the judgment of the officers for the mandates of the legislation. I believe it is clear from the body cam footage that stating the officers twisted themselves into knots trying to find a way to avoid effecting an arrest is a gross mischaracterization of what actually happened. Law enforcement is being second-guessed now more than ever, which has led to officers taking more caution and time as allowed before making a decision to try and avoid the inevitable second-guessing. These officers were authentic in their interactions and treated Brian and Gabby with kindness and respect. I would say the officers displayed sympathy and empathy for this couple, which undoubtedly led to Officer Pratt second-guessing himself, despite the fact he said multiple times what needed to happen. Officer Pratt resorted to calling a supervisor and then rereading the assault statute. From there, the statute is not fully read, and what was read was misinterpreted, which led to not arresting anyone in this incident.